It's always a pleasure to introduce Sean Burke and Andrea Zuber. Sean is with the Disability Law Center, and Andrea is the Social Services Director in Dakota County. So come on up, guys.
What Andrea and I are going to do is going to give us some background and context about how we even got to this position. What is this position that we're in? And I would like to thank Dr. Zangara for introducing the Olmstead case. I'm going to pick up on where she left off. And then what I'm going to do is tell you a little bit more about myself and in some ways I think why I'm here to explain some of what I'm going to be talking about. What we're going to do for the next 15 or 20 minutes or so is I'm going to answer these three main questions as comprehensively as I can so that you can have a better understanding, whether you're a person with a disability or a family member or an advocate or a provider, you can have a better understanding about where our social service system is at this moment in time and where we're going. The first question I have up there, though, is the most important. And that is where we've been. And it's not just the most important because I'm a history teacher, or was in a former life, but we will never improve where we're going to go unless we understand where we came from. So at times, my comments are going to feel a little bit like a history lesson. I will do my best to tell the story of the history and not just the boring dates and facts. To that end, let me get started with a personal story. The story of the Olmstead case can really be broken down into stories of individuals. Individuals who a lot of assumptions were made about them. I want to introduce you to one individual in my life. Her name's Sarah. I met Sarah when I was a young teenager, probably 12, 13, 14. And she moved into the neighborhood. She moved across the street. Sarah was a young woman with Down syndrome, just a couple years younger than me. And I was one of these kids. I don't know if you have anyone like this in your family. Maybe you were like this. I was a firstborn, and I came from a real kind of strict Catholic background. So something about my background told me that I had to be perfect and take care of others and do good things. And so when Sarah moved into the community, my first reaction was, wow, she needs my help. She needs to be looked after. And she would be out in the park. We lived kind of in this big green space, and I would kind of peer outside, and she'd be playing all alone because her mom sent her out to play all alone because she was just fine. But I would say, oh, maybe she's in trouble. Maybe she's in danger. Maybe she needs help. So I would go out there, and after a while, I realized that she was okay. She would be fine. But I still had this urge to protect and thought that I was doing good deeds by helping her out. And little by little, she came to kind of trust and maybe just tolerate me. But I think we became friendly. And we played sports. She loved sports, and I would help her with homework. High school came around, and I didn't think, we lost touch a little bit, even though we lived next door, because I was a high school guy, right? By senior year, the first day of senior year, I remember this story vividly. She was a freshman. She was just coming into high school. And by senior year, I had finally worked up the courage to talk to girls, finally. So I'm sitting in the lunchroom, and there's probably 2 or 3 girls in my head. I'd like to think that there were 7 or 8, right? But we're at the lunch table, and we're chatting, and I'm finally feeling like a true senior male. And Sarah walks into the lunchroom, and she sees me, a friendly face from across the way. And she runs up with the biggest smile, so excited to see me, comes up, kind of gives me an embrace and says, "Hi, Sean, how's it going? Isn't this wonderful? First day of school." And I remember this vividly because it's still one of the most embarrassing and shameful times of my life. I gave her the brush off. I gave her almost didn't even know who she was. I felt embarrassed at the moment that I was being approached by her because in my mind, I had built up all these assumptions about what our relationship was. I had built up all these assumptions that, first of all, this was a person with a disability who needed to be protected and looked after, and she needed my help. She believed that over the years we had developed a friendship. She thought we were friends. What do you do with friends? You run up and hug them and say hi. I tell this story because in a lot of ways, the history of our service system is the history of this story, and I'm going to get into that right now. We are a service system built on assumptions about who people are and that they're intimately tied to their disability, and that that disability is innately limiting in some way. And not only defines them, but defines who they're going to be and what they're going to do and what they're capable of. I'll come back to Sarah later on in my presentation. But what I want to do now is transition into how the 1999 Supreme Court decision that Dr. Zingara introduced is the game changer of all game changers for these assumptions. It's blowing up our assumptions. You say, 1999? Well, let me tell you, folks, the world of civil rights and legal rights moves very, very slowly. Let me tell you what I mean. It was not that long ago, 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, even into the 80s and 90s, but particularly in the 1950s and 60s and early 70s, our country became addicted to a service system built on institutions. The picture on the top there is a place called Willowbrook State School. It was built in New York, and it stands as one of the most notorious institutions in our country's history, but it also stands in for all the other institutions similar to it around the country. Willowbrook was filled with young children, teenagers, and even adults who had disabilities. Maybe they were born with a developmental disability. Maybe they had mental illness. Maybe in some cases they were just a little off or not normal. Oftentimes people were put in these institutions because their parents were told by treating professionals, by the service system, that your son or daughter is never going to be accepted or cared for in the community, so you need to send them to these places where they will be cared for. And that was a lie. And there were two parts to that lie. The first part, in some ways, is the most traumatic, the fact that they would be cared for. Places like Willowbrook were so notorious because people weren't cared for. There was neglect, there was abuse, there was maltreatment, there was malnourishment. Robert Kennedy was Attorney General for the United States. He toured Willowbrook State School in the 1960s. There's an interview with him where he compares the conditions in the school to a zoo. That's the 1960s. The state school isn't shut down until, of all people, Geraldo Rivera does an investigative report in the 1980s to actually get visual images of why this place is so terrible and the conditions that people have been suffering for decades. So the first lie is that institutions would take care of individuals with disabilities. And advocates and others across the country who wanted to shut these places down attached themselves to that lie and used that as the main mechanism to start shutting down these places. Now in Minnesota, our history is a little bit quicker than the rest of the country because unlike states like Georgia, that Dr. Zingara mentioned, we in Minnesota shut down our institutions or planned to close our institutions way back kind of in the early 70s. And through the 70s and into the early 80s, we were not sued by the federal government to shut these down. There was a state suit that closed down our state institutions. And in exchange, we answered the question, well, how is my son or daughter going to live in the community? We invested in what's known, it's really important because it's a tool that you may be using in your everyday life, and it really is the tool that's transformed how we do services in this country. HCBS. Anyone heard that acronym before? HCBS, Home and Community Based. Everyone heard that term before? PCA services, have you heard that term before? Okay. Home and Community Based Waiver, have you heard that term before? If you've heard of any of these terms, these are the critical tools that allowed us in Minnesota to shut down places like Willowbrook, we had state schools similar, and to invest in alternatives. Well, what are alternatives? Well, they are group homes or day programs or PCA services so that people with disabilities can actually live in a community setting but also have the services and supports they need to thrive. that is in Minnesota happening in the 80s. Now, in some ways it's very primitive because it never happened before, and we'll get to that in a little bit. I want to turn our attention, though, to nationally what's happening in the 80s and 90s, because it's a much slower picture, and it's why it took until 1999 till we even got the Olmstead case. One of the women who Dr. Zingara referred to, her name is Lois Curtis. She's the real famous person in this picture, not the guy on the right. Woman in the middle, right? Lois Curtis was born in Georgia, African-American, female, born with both developmental disabilities and mental illness, right? Not given the best head start in life, really. She's one of the most inspiring human beings, I think, in American history. And I don't exaggerate because, again, I think the Olmstead case, which is her case, is like the Brown v. Board of Education for people with disabilities. So let's dig a little bit more into what she did and what actually came out of this decision. So as Dr. Zingara said, she was sitting, languishing in a hospital, and this was in the 90s. And what she and her other plaintiffs were actually saying was they asked their state to invest in HCBS. They looked at models like Minnesota and said, what's the big deal, guys? Why can't we have PCA services like they have in Minnesota? Or why can't we have day services like they have in Minnesota? Or at least group homes or something, some sort of non-institutional service in the community. And Georgia said, no, we don't have to do that. We don't think we have to do that. We don't have to invest in that. We build hospitals and nursing homes and institutions. We don't build or invest in community services. Well, the legal theory that Lois and her team used was that denial, that no, that persistence, which in reality in itself is just an assumption, right? The assumption is people with disabilities, why would they need this anyway? It's going to be too expensive. It's not going to work. The only place that people need services are in institutions. That assumption they challenged on the basis that it's illegal. Because what you're really doing is you're segregating people with disabilities in institutions. And that segregation is illegal. This theory that they had was not just born out of thin air. In the early 90s, we had the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which, like the Civil Rights Acts in the 1960s, was the real key piece of federal law that said no more. People with disabilities are equal. Like all key pieces of legislation, though, they need that case, they need that champion. And so Lois and her attorneys dug in and used the Americans with Disabilities Act. And they went through the court system and they said, this law says that states like Georgia, they have to invest in services. They have to allow me to be in the community. They have to use that money that they would otherwise spend in the institution and spend it on things like PCA services or employment services. And they won. They won. It's one of the most amazing victories in all civil rights movements, but the victory for people with disabilities. And it's a real important case, and I would suggest that above all else, this one paragraph stands out as the most important. Because in this case, what's so important is we can see the evolution of civil rights happening. Remember when we closed down the institutions in Minnesota, the argument was these places are maltreating people. They're abusive, terrible places. And that's true. But you know, there's another characteristic of institutions that make them so pernicious and so awful. And that is, if you notice where they were all built around the country, they were all usually built way out in the countryside. Built away. Almost like we don't even want to see or know that you exist. And it's that characteristic of institutions that the Olmstead case attacked and is attacking to this day. And this paragraph gets at it. Justice Ginsburg, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who wrote the opinion, used this language that I would frame and put on any disability advocacy wall of any office in our state and around the country. Because what she's saying is it's not just that institutions are bad because people are maltreated, but because confinement in an institution is bad because it cuts you off. It limits your chance for family relationships, for other relationships, through economic independence. It also cuts off your educational advancement and your cultural enrichment. And it's not just that it cuts off people with disabilities from others, it's that it cuts off the rest of the community from people with disabilities. That's the real pernicious characteristic of institutionalization. We don't have time to go through the intricacies of the case, but I do want you to walk away with one kind of basic understanding of what an Olmstead right is. Individuals with disabilities, if they're getting any sort of services from the state, they have Olmstead rights. And what the Olmstead right is that if you're receiving those services, you have a right to receive those services in the most integrated setting appropriate to your needs. As the last slide that I clicked over said, basically goes through some of the caveats. You know, some people like to say, I have Olmstead rights, I can use them whenever I want. There are some caveats. They're real kind of basic common sense caveats. But the heart of the case is this. If you receive services, you get any of those services I mentioned, or if you receive any other types of services paid for by the state, you have a right to live in the most integrated setting. And what does integrated mean? All integration means is that you're enabled to interact with people who don't have disabilities. That's your right. And it's this lesson that is so powerful because this is the tool that's going to break down assumptions. This is the tool that's going to break down assumptions. Now, let's go back to our history lesson before I wrap up with kind of a couple of final stories. This, unfortunately, Justice Ginsburg wrote the opinion, and it wasn't on say it was a Tuesday or Wednesday. It wasn't Thursday that, boom, everything changed overnight. In fact, I would suggest to you that we are still right at the very early stages of making the promise of Olmstead an actual reality. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is Georgia and other states who are really invested in these non-community-based models have taken a long time to come around. In fact, there are still lawsuits, whether they're brought by individuals like Lois or whether they're brought by the federal government, the Department of Justice. There are still lawsuits all the time about states that are refusing to offer people services in the community. So we are still on a very kind of cutting edge and still early development of Olmstead. And one of those places that's the most cutting edge is in the employment field. What do I mean by that? In the middle of this slide, I highlight a few kind of Olmstead issues that I think Minnesota and the rest of the country are dealing with. And one of those issues still is segregated day employment. Real quick background. Back in the 80s, when we developed in Minnesota our service system, again, really radical for the time, we fell in love with one or two models of doing things. And the day service model that we fell in love with in this state was a DT&H model, day training and rehabilitation, or a segregated day center. A big building where people with disabilities would go to, and there would be activities, and they were not maltreated because it wasn't the institution, because when it was done for the day, they'd go home, usually to a group home or to their parents' home. And so were these centers a huge leap forward from the institutions? Of course. But in Minnesota, we fell in love with this model, and a lot of other states did too. And if you think about it, we haven't really grown out of that model enough. And then the Olmstead case comes, and we're still kind of attached to this model. Well, now, just in the last couple of years, 2 states in particular have been sued because they, like Minnesota, invest a lot of their community-based dollars in these center-based models, in these segregated models. And at least one of these states, Rhode Island, rather than going through a big lawsuit, settled their lawsuit before it even got started with the United States government. And they said, no, you're right. These settings are not Olmstead friendly. And why is that? Because they're not the most integrated setting. Because people with disabilities are not enabled to interact with folks who don't have disabilities. That's the core truth to them. And so Rhode Island agreed over a 10-year process with the federal government that because of Olmstead, because of this right, because it's so critical that individuals have the right to integrate, that we're going to change our service system. And now states all around the country are looking at that. They're also looking at a case in Oregon. And in our own Olmstead plan, as Dr. Zangara said, we're doing a lot of internal reflection as a state about where are we going to put our service dollars when it comes to employment. And I would suggest to you that because of the Olmstead case, because of our Olmstead plan, because of the innate right that individuals have with disabilities to interact with those who don't have disabilities, we're going to see a large change over the next several years about how individuals with disabilities work in this state and the type of services they receive. And that's why groups like APSE are so important and so critical, because they have the knowledge and the know-how and the ability to actually make supported employment work. I said I'd finish with a story, and I will. I do want to highlight one other real important legal change that is happening and that you may hear about. So one of the real interesting things, and it's interesting to me because I'm a history teacher and I'm an attorney, I'm going to try to make it interesting to you. For 10 years, from 1999 to 2009, I would suggest, and I don't think this is too controversial, that our United States government did not do enough to actually enforce the Olmstead decision. Our Department of Justice has the responsibility to go around to states and knock on their doors and make sure that they're actually following this law. And I would say if you look at the 10-year period, they did not do a very good job. In 2009, they made a renewal, a promise to do better. And since that time, I think they have. And not only did they start knocking on a lot more states' doors, okay? They haven't knocked on ours yet. We've done a lot of our own internal reflection in Minnesota. That's why we have our Olmstead plan. So we haven't gotten the door knocked. A lot of other states have. You know who else got their doors knocked, though? The federal government that actually gives us our HCBS dollars. It's called CMS, Center for Medicare Services. It's a really important office because this is where all the money for our Medicaid program, the money that funds employment services, a lot of supported employment services and HCBS services, this is where it comes from. And you know, they were giving this money to states like Minnesota, and they weren't ensuring that it was spent on true community integration. So what happened was our friends at the federal government, the Department of Justice, who were suing states, they also went to their peers, and they knocked on their door, and they said, yeah, guys and gals, we have a problem. We're investing tons of money into states, and we don't even know if that money is actually being used on truly integrative services. And so we are right now on the cusp, but there's a 5-year requirement that every state's going to have to go through to prove that they're using HCBS dollars appropriately. And I love this rule, and not just because I'm a legal nerd. I love this rule because as an advocate for people with disabilities, it's an advocate's type of rule. It's not just is someone being safe in their home or is someone being safe at work? That should be a given. The requirement of the rule is that if you get money to serve individuals with disabilities, you have to make sure that the person has some freedom to control their own schedule, that they have a chance to actually have integrated employment, that they actually get an opportunity to try it out. That is a first in the history of social services. And again, we have Olmstead to thank to break down that barrier and that assumption. Before I introduce Andrea, let me just go back to that story and wrap it up. The story about Sarah, if you remember. When we last left off, right, you have that idiot high school guy who gave her a true community experience, right? A community experience of meeting a jerk in public. Well, she rebounded. She was fine. Partly because she had such a strong social safety net around her. And I don't mean services, I mean her mom was a real advocate and never, ever, ever assumed that Sarah would ever just live in a group home or work in a day training center. And you know how I know that? It was a couple years ago, my mom called me up and she said, you know, I ran into Sarah's mom in the store today. You'll never believe what happened. I said, Sarah? Oh, yeah, Sarah from growing up. Yeah. How are things? She said, well, Sarah's doing great. She went to an associate's program and got an associate's degree. She's living with a friend in her own apartment, and she works down at the rec center teaching and working with kids on sports. And I dropped the phone for just a half a second, and I thought, wait, I thought you said Sarah. And my mom said, yeah, Sarah from across the street. And it clicked. And I said, of course. And all of those assumptions that I'm still recovering from started to dissipate. Of course she's teaching kids about sports. because she loves sports. Of course she's living and working in the community because her mom and her friends never expected anything else. And I finally got redeemed because that little ubiquitous blue internet screen that we see all the time, the Facebook screen, right? A couple of months ago, I got a cling, will you be my friend, from Sarah. And I finally got the chance to redeem myself and click yes, we are friends. This is where we're going in the next several years and the next generation. We're going to break down these assumptions. We're going to do it individually, one by one, with individuals like Courtney and Sarah and Lois. And we're also going to do it as a service system, services that enable individuals to have relationships in the community. Andrea?
All right, talk about a tough act to follow. Thank you, Sean. One more round of applause for Sean Burke. So, yes, I am Andrea Zuber, and I work at Dakota County Social Services. And I am so excited that this is happening tonight in Dakota County for all of you guys. Luckily, I had a little in with the Family Involvement Committee because I'm part of that group that have been planning these. But we really wanted to get this good information to you guys tonight. So glad you're here. So you've heard a lot about all of these things that are happening on the federal and on the state level, right? That are shifting the way that we are going to be delivering services and supports, shifting the expectations that we have for how people can live their lives in the community. And so I wanted to just touch on, so what is that going to mean at the local level? Because in our state, we are a state-run county, we're a state oversight, county-run system. So the state sets the policies, the state has the plans, and then the counties are the ones that actually implement them. So how is that actually going to work with us, for us at the local level? So one of the things that the Minnesota Olmstead Plan required was that the state of Minnesota develop an employment-first policy. And Dr. Zingara touched on how that was developed this last September. And the policy says that employment is the first and expected outcome for people with disabilities in Minnesota. So what does that mean, right? So what it means is that, as you just heard, historically, we have typically defaulted to a sheltered, center-based setting for somebody's vocational or employment services, right? We call it day training and habilitation in the state of Minnesota. We also call them community rehabilitation programs. And people would be getting done and ready to graduate from high school, and they would say, what's next? What's going to happen to me as I move into adult services? And generally, we as service professionals, we as county case managers, teachers, providers, would say, well, probably the best thing for you to do is to go into a center-based day training and habilitation center. That's, kind of what most people that have your ability level or your skill level or your set of disabilities do. And what the Employment First policy is doing is it's flipping that, where now we're going to say that we're going to look at employment as the very first option for people. So we're not going to default anymore to the more segregated options. And the first thing we're going to say is, well, let's explore employment. Let's see how that would look in your life. This is the vision of the Employment First policy, and we just want to make it really clear that when we're talking about employment, we just mean a regular job in the community, like anybody else would have. And so one of the things is that you're kind of hearing this theme, that the Employment First policy puts out a vision that everybody can work, right, if that's what they're choosing. And so in Dakota County, and I think in a lot of other counties across the state, a lot of this change is being driven by federal and state changes. But our service delivery philosophy really matches the Employment First policy in that we really believe in the innate wisdom and capabilities that every single person has. So how are we really going to figure out how to make this happen for people if that's what they choose? So I'm going to tell you just a little bit about, so this hasn't quite started yet. So if you have a county case manager or you're part of the service delivery system right now, you might not be seeing these things yet, but this is going to kind of be how we're going to start to implement the Minnesota Olmstead Plan, the Minnesota Employment First policy at the local level. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to assess, right? We need to say, what are your support needs and what is it that's that you need to be able to have to live in the community. That's one of the key county roles that we play. So when you think about making employment the first option that we talk about with people, it's still going to be done on an individual level by taking a look at every single person's unique needs and figuring out what those are. The second thing is that we're going to really dive into a deeper person-centered planning process. So this really gets at, instead of just saying, usually most people who have your kind of disability or your support needs go into this type of a setting, we're going to really have a good conversation and say, what is important for you, of course, like we always have, but also really talk about what is important to you. And again, base it on those individuals. So we have a lot of people who are raising their hand right now, right, and saying, I absolutely want a job. And then we have a lot of people who would say, I don't know, sure, that might be something I would want to try. Those are people who are considered to be not opposed to working. And then there's people who are like, I do not want to work, I'm good. And so there's going to be a continuum of care in place, and it's really based on every single individual person and what we're hearing from them through this person-centered planning process, what's important to them and for them. But in order for people to decide, yes, I want a job, or yeah, sure, I would try that out, that sounds okay, or absolutely no, I do not want to work right now, we want to make sure that people actually have an informed choice and can make an informed decision about whether or not they want employment. So what that means is that we aren't going to get into a space like we have historically where we're saying, well, do you like it where you are right now, where all your friends are, and where all your friends are going next year when they graduate? Is that kind of where you want to be? Yeah, okay, see, that's their choice, they made that choice. We want to really be able, and the Minnesota Employment First policy requires us to get people actual experience so that they can base their choice on experience. And they can understand what it's like to work, they can get really good information about benefits and how their benefits are going to interact with their work, and so that they can actually make a very good informed choice and understand what it is that they're choosing. And then it's going to be up to us to make sure that we're putting those services and supports together in the most integrated setting possible. And I love this slide that sort of lays out how we used to have the person in the center, and then we would wrap services around them as the first thing, right? And then the family, and then the community. And now this is really putting the person and the family and the community at the center, and services all over the place. So how do we make sure we're doing those services in the most integrated setting possible? So in Dakota County, one of the ways that we're starting this effort is, again, I said it has to be on an individual level, right, person by person. And so the plan has, Dr. Zangara just talked about how the plan has a lot of goals. And there's a lot of stuff written in the plan that says, this many people will have this many jobs by this year. And then by the next year, this many more people will have jobs. Well, who are they? How do we know that, right? How do we know who are the people? Yes, I want to work, or I don't know, sure, maybe I'll try it out. We're collecting data on every single person that we provide services through our community living services and our adult services sections on in Dakota County. And we're going out and we're asking, where are you living now? Where do you want to be living? Where are you working now? And where do you want to be working? People still are not maybe able to make those based on those informed decisions with experience, but at least we're going to have a baseline of right now, with what people know right now, who wants to work and who can we really start with. And we're going to start with, great, if you say that you want to work, we're going to develop a service plan, we're going to wrap supports around you, and we're going to start with you, and we're going to try to make this happen. It's no longer can we say, you know what, we don't really think you're ready yet, we don't really think you're stable, we think maybe you need to figure out your medications or get a little bit faster at doing your piece rate work. We're gonna say, if you say, yep, I wanna work in the community, Olmstead plan, Minnesota Employment First policy require us to say, then we're gonna figure out how to help you make that happen with the right services and supports in place. And don't confuse independent employment with individualized employment, right? It's individualized employment, it's a regular job, but it's with all the supports that you would need to make it happen. So we're starting with data, that's where we're starting. We're doing a lot of other stuff around getting good training for case managers, getting good training to people and their families like you guys tonight. This is just one path on that journey. Starting to work with schools to try to figure out how we can get people into work experiences before they graduate so that they can make some good information. and working really closely with organizations like the Olmstead Implementation Office, like Minnesota APSI, and the advocacy organizations that are putting this on tonight, so that we can continue to educate ourselves and figure out how we can really support people and make this happen if this is what they want. And then last but not least at all is that we definitely have a role in making sure that if we're putting these services in place for you, we're assessing the quality, and then we're improving the quality if it's not working and it's not doing what we're supposed to do. So that's just kind of the end of that cycle. So that gives you a little bit about how this will be implemented on the local level.